All right, and we're live now. Hi everybody, welcome back for another week of the Open Ag Learning Series, where we're going to discuss this week OFoot, which is a tool developed at Washington State University specifically for organic farmers to help them assess their climate change footprint and inputs. So, my name is Dan Kane. I'm a research associate with Michigan State University, interested in sustainable ag and open source technology and its applications. So, and my co-host here is Doran Cox. Doran, if you want to introduce yourself a little too.
Great, thanks Dan. Doran Cox with Farm Hack and Green Start, and a farmer in New Hampshire, and I'm really excited to have Lynne with us here today. I met Lynne at the Soil Renaissance project down most recently in Texas and in Oklahoma, and I'm really excited to have her present her work to this group and start cross-pollinating.
Great. And it looks like Kevin, you on the line here too?
I am, yes.
Great. If you want to just introduce yourself real quick, what you do.
Sure. My name is Kevin Boyer. I'm with the 11th Hour Project. I met a lot of these guys this spring at Icinus Ranch, and I'm super interested in ways that we can monitor and model to support producers.
Great. And so with that, I think we'll turn it over to you, Lynne, and we'll probably all fade to the background a little bit while you present, but interested in hearing what you have to say.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to turn on screen share, and let's see. So, does everybody see my slide?
Perfect. Looks good.
Perfect. Looks great.
Great. So, as I said, I'm Lynne Carpenter-Boggs. I'm at Washington State University in Pullman, in eastern Washington, and I will be talking a little bit about the overall picture of environmental footprint of farming, how it relates more specifically to organic farming, and then our project, which we have nicknamed OFoot for Organic Farming Footprints. So I do have lots of other people, of course, working with me on this project. Cornelius Adewale is one of my graduate students who's been with this project pretty much from day one. And David Granitstein is also one of my strong partners who is has been a real force in developing sustainable agriculture in Washington State. So I want to just mention that we started this project actually because of requests from a few farmers. So we have a fairly strong organic ag movement in Washington State, and one of my friends who's a consultant actually was getting asked by organic growers, okay, I'm growing organically, you know, I think I'm doing things right, but in a lot of cases I don't really know what my environmental footprint is, and like greenhouse gases, I'm probably producing some. I certainly use fuel. You know, how much am I using, and should I, you know, how big is my carbon footprint? So we wanted to start the project acknowledging that we're doing this because organic growers in particular, from our experience, really want to know what their footprints are and how to do things better. So we want to give people an honest picture of what's going on at their farms, and help them to make decisions. So we have a vision statement which changes somewhat over time, but basically organic and ecological agriculture is managed by people who balance profit goals with stewardship goals. increasingly decision tools help guide choices that meet these goals. So agriculture does have environmental footprints. I think we're all quite aware of the breadth of those, including production of greenhouse gases and use and pollution of water, soil degradation, what go into all of those. And there are certainly some good studies out there that help to guide us, and some summaries of what's believed to be produced from agriculture. So this is an 07. These are actually from EPA also. Summaries of the greenhouse gas emissions from U.S. agriculture and then from the U.S. in total. And agriculture is the major producer of nitrous oxide in the U.S. and a major producer of methane and a fairly minor producer of carbon dioxide. But those gases are coming from a variety of sources. So the cropping system and decisions on what crops are grown, how much tillage is done, what type, how much nitrogen fertilizer is used and how it's managed, the production of livestock and manure management, use of organic amendments, other forms of energy use, including irrigation and processing. All these things can be significant factors in determining the carbon footprint from agriculture. And again, there are some good summaries of what's currently known. This from the EPA in 09 suggests that almost half of the total CO2 equivalent from agriculture is actually coming from soil management producing nitrous oxide. So that's mostly because we're using large amounts of nitrogen fertilizers, and in the processes of nitrification and denitrification, some of that forms nitrous oxide, which is highly volatile and also a very potent greenhouse gas. Another approximately 30% from enteric fermentation, so having livestock, and the amount of methane that they are producing does depend on the feeds that they're on. So so we have some information out there, but what we are finding is that these generalities don't necessarily apply to any given farm. So as we start to do individual studies on individual operations or types of operations, we get more specific information, and therefore we might be better able to do something about it. So this was a study of an Eastern Washington dryland winter wheat rotation, and this was estimating that about half of the total climate change impact was from soil-released N2O, but another 22% was the energy use in producing that nitrogen. And of course, in this kind of a system, we don't have livestock, so there is no methane coming from enteric fermentation, but a lot of fuel being used in tillage, and a lot of embedded energy also in the large equipment. So we're starting to see that every operation is going to have different specific activities and inputs, and therefore different footprints. So in trying to look at how organic agriculture might be different, organic ag practices are different partially because of the regulations on them, and partially because of just common practices in organic operations. So in terms of the regulations, there is a statement in the NOP regulations that organic operations must maintain or improve the natural resources of the operation, including soil and water quality. So this would relate to greenhouse gas balances by affecting the amount of carbon sequestration or release from the soil. But this, you know, and this is a really prevalent, strong idea in organic agriculture, but it's not actually regulated. There's no consistent monitoring of soil quality, but it's something that people like to believe is happening, and many studies have shown on average is happening. But of course it's going to be different on every operation. So there is expectation that they're maintaining or improving soil, including carbon. They are not allowed to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, but there are some mined sources of nitrogen they can use, and of course they do still need sources of nitrogen. So green manures are used, manures, and some mined materials. Other regulations that would affect the carbon footprint include the fact that livestock have to have a certain proportion of their feed from pasture. And then some other common practices include that they are often using organic amendments, more diverse rotations, including green manure and cover crops. Often, organic operations use significant amounts of tillage for weed control. But studies have suggested the net energy inputs are usually lower because they're not using nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which requires a lot of energy to produce. So again, we do know some of the factors that are involved in determining the carbon footprint of organic farms, but every farm is diverse, and so the results are going to be site-specific. There are many other studies looking at other aspects of environmental impact of organic farming, and I won't really go into this, but the second bullet shows that there have been many studies on soil carbon, again showing that there generally is more carbon sequestration happening in organic production. And there have been studies on total energy use, and as I mentioned, total energy use is usually lower on a per hectare basis or a per acre basis, though not necessarily on a per unit of production basis. So, for instance, not necessarily per bushel of wheat produced. So in this project, what we really wanted to do was give producers a tool that that they could use to make reasonable estimates of their own farm's footprint and identify the hotspots, or those places, times, activities, and materials that are contributing strongly to their farm's footprint. So the OFoot tool was produced, or OFoot 1.0, I'll say, was produced through a NIFA OREI grant, and yeah, we shortened the title to Organic Farming Footprints, make it a bit more memorable. And as I mentioned, I've had a lot of people helping out with this, and who remain engaged, including 5 farmers who have been very generous with their time and have shared all of their information about their inputs and activities. So the goals of the project were to assess the greenhouse gases of organic farms and inputs in order to give growers opportunities to reduce their greenhouse gas production and allow for crowdsourcing of solutions once we see what those hotspots are. So the questions for the producers was, what is the carbon footprint of my farm? What are the activities and inputs that contribute most to the carbon footprint of the farm? and what changes could significantly reduce the footprint of the farm. So the OFoot tool, again, OFoot 1.0, is actually live online. You can go to ofoot.wsu.edu, and a version of it is live there. So a user logs in and puts in information about your location, activities, and inputs. The information that comes out is estimating your greenhouse gas emissions, soil carbon changes, nitrogen leaching, and essentially your footprint. So I want to show some examples. So some information about two of these farms from my student Cornelius. So he is the one. He and David were the ones who went to all of these farms and rummaged through all of their information and did on-farm assessments. So essentially case studies of all of these farms. And what he's done is essentially a partial life cycle analysis. So looking at the inputs and materials used on the farm from the cradle to the farm gate. So not actually to the grave, because for a farm there isn't necessarily a grave. It's more about what are you selling off of the farm. That would be the end point of the products we're looking for. So accounting for the activities and materials, everything that comes into the farm, and then to the point where it either stays or leaves the farm gate. And part of this was also an assessment of the soil dynamics, so looking at the gas fluxes and carbon exchange in the soil using a separate model. So we actually did a separate model is built into the OFoot system that simulates crop and soil dynamics. So on the first farm was a very small operation. I think about a 2-acre area was being modeled, and so Cornelius has this information presented in a couple of different ways. You can, for instance, look at the crops individually. So there were 9 primary crops and cover crops being grown, and just looking at the different crops, you can see that the potato, pepper, and cauliflower had most significant footprints in terms of the area footprint. And I know that for the peppers in particular, that was surprisingly big, because they were starting the plants in a small greenhouse, and then out in the field they were also using a plastic hoop house or a large row cover over it. So those small infrastructures contributed quite a bit to the footprint of growing peppers. And you can also look at the various operations. So these are all of the operations and the large individual inputs being used. And you can see that activities like disking, disking was a large contributor, and therefore it's identified as a hotspot. So, but several things would go into the carbon footprint of the disking operation. So you would have the fuel use for those operations. You also have the embedded carbon in the tractor and the disc, and then you also have carbon released from those disking operations. Fertilizers were a big contributor. So on this particular farm, the producer buys a custom custom certified, custom organic blend of fertilizer. Use different terminology. It's a registered product for organic production, but it still has a really significant footprint, which surprised all of us. Another big one was irrigation, and this was something that was identified that the producer can actually think about doing something about reducing that footprint. So once some of those hot spots were identified, then we can start asking questions about what the alternatives are. And we don't have significant capacity in the tool right now to look at alternatives because there are a lot of alternatives, but we do have a couple of different power sources available. So you can choose that you're using diesel versus biodiesel, electricity that is from Washington State, electricity that's from a more average U.S. electric grid, or a solar system. So let me, I need to mention that in Washington, we are blessed with some very large rivers, and about 90% of the electricity in Washington State comes from the dams, from hydroelectric power. And while those have various kinds of environmental and social footprints, the actual carbon footprint is very low. So when we looked at this farm's situation, and you can see that the status quo, the current situation is that blue line, and compared it to, for instance, switching the irrigation from its current electric power onto a solar system. We compare the blue line and the purple line. So moving irrigation to a solar system barely reduced the footprint at all. Versus comparing the blue line to the green line, where we looked at converting from using fossil fuel diesel to biodiesel, had a major impact, reducing the carbon footprints in total. Or if she did both of those choices, she could reduce the total carbon footprint of her farm by 34%. So in this situation, Cornelius identified 5 activities as major hotspots, which were fuel use, energy for irrigation, fertilization, plastics, and actually another surprise was the peat that was being used in the greenhouse. And again, so some of these things will be reasonable to change, and some of them won't. So, you know, fertilization, the grower is very happy with this fertilizer. It comes at a good price. The yield effects are very good, so for the time being, they're going to stick with that fertilizer. Peat, however, they're now looking at the use of coir and increasing the compost to dramatically reduce or get rid of the use of peat. So just a few slides coming up next about one of the other farms that we looked at, which is also certified organic and grows some of the same crops, but is on a totally different scale. So the first farm we were looking at about a 2-acre area, and this second farm is closer to 600 acres. Oh, why isn't some of the text and whatnot is not showing up on this slide for some reason. At any rate, the footprint was indeed different. So there was still a lot of footprint coming from diesel use. There's much less fertilizer being used, although still some. This producer does very, very heavy emphasis on cover crops. And so some of the diesel use here is for growing and turning under those cover crops. On the other hand, he doesn't have the same level of footprint from purchased fertilizers. Here too, there was a lot of energy being used and a lot of carbon footprint from the irrigation. So here you can see just the wells, using the wells themselves was a big part of the footprint. So comparing these two, on the small farm is shown on the left and the large farm is shown on the right. And most of the footprint of the small farm was from the equipment and operations, and whereas most of the footprint of the large farm on the right was from their soil emissions. So again, we can only do something about our own operations, and we can only know where to target our changes if we know what our own source of footprints are. So the person on the left is looking at changing some of the operations and materials that are being used. The person on the right actually per hectare and per unit production has a much lower footprint. But what we see there is a lot more carbon dioxide coming from soil emissions, partly because he's doing these really intensive green manure operations. So there's a lot of carbon just coming and going from his system. So one of the things that Cornelius is following up on is the use of cover crops. It's both of these farms, and I think all of our model farms are using cover crops in different ways. But really starting to tease apart then what are the changes in carbon and nitrous oxide at different depths in the soil, depending on your intensity and frequency of cover crops. So again, we're seeing that the carbon footprint and other impacts of agriculture are farm specific, and we think that it is useful to identify hotspots so that those can be targets for reducing the footprint of a given farm. Once that information is available, then farmers, businesses, and policymakers can innovate. Well, researchers should be in there too. Can innovate and focus efforts on finding viable alternatives to cool those hotspots. So using the current OFoot tool, we can now estimate farm-specific carbon footprint, nitrogen leaching, soil greenhouse gases, and soil carbon changes. So now I want to take you a little bit deeper into the current state of this OFoot tool. So when you go to the site, this is our intro page. This is Julie Sullivan. She was actually the first graduate from WSU's major in organic farming systems. So she's now the face of OFoot. So you can log in, and the first thing you do is identify where you are. So this is actually a shot from the early summer period. It does get much greener than this, but this is actually my place. We call our little farmlet Valhalla. And so you identify where you are, and that allows the tool to go out and pull in soils information and climate information. Right now we can grab climate information essentially just from the Pacific Northwest, but we can pull soils information from anywhere in the US. Then you are asked to put in information about your operation. So some of the equipments used here I actually have, and some of them I just wish I had, but for purposes of showing examples, you enter in information about all of your equipment, including estimates of the weight and the lifespan. The weight we found was the most efficient way of estimating the total embedded energy. And we do have, I think it's actually linked, or we at least say that you can go to tractors.com and look up the weight of just about any tractor in the world. And we do also ask for the lifespan, because we're then estimating what is the embedded footprint on a per year basis. So the longer you plan to and can keep a piece of equipment in use, then the larger your denominator is and the lower the annual footprint. You can also put in information about infrastructure and the consumables. So on the consumables in particular, this is a massive potential area. Right now we have a few dozen different items that you can choose from for your consumables, but of course there are thousands of different things that people use. So this is definitely part of the tool that we're interested in beefing up over the next phase. And then you put in information about your crops, including every operation and the date that you do it. So this is the part of the tool that is then modeled for crop and soil dynamics. And you can also play with these different scenarios. So you can save multiple cropping system scenarios for a given farm. So, for instance, I did a scenario where I was growing bush beans. I did one where I was doing a continuous wheat operation. I had various rotations I've looked at. So the output I'm going to show you is from the scenario doing continuous wheat. And so this is one of the output screens that you'll actually see. What's the footprint from the consumables, infrastructure, from the equipment, and then the land units. So the land unit there means that's the crop and soil gas dynamics. And in this scenario, that was the major source of footprint. So when we talk to producers, then we're asking, what are the other kinds of information outputs and comparisons would you like to see? So right now, what you can also see is just a pie chart of your sources of footprint. So in this scenario, again, most of it was coming from gas emissions from the soil. And it pops up on a different page, but you also get an estimation of the nitrogen leaching from that scenario. Right now we have some links out to other sites, but we are thinking about pulling some of this information actually into the tool so that you can get comparisons to start thinking about. So, for instance, this scenario, we can relate this to the driving of an average American vehicle, and showing that, for instance, my car, which gets about 25 miles per gallon, not that great. My car, if I drive it 9,365 miles, is producing as much CO2 in a year, and that's both from the fuel use and the estimate of embedded energy, is producing as much CO2 equivalent per year as this scenario of doing continuous wheat on just a 4-hectare area. So with these kind of comparisons, we're hoping this will give producers more idea about, well, should I really even bother trying to change what I'm doing in my farm operations, or is it easier for me to just start driving less or to get a different car? So as far as decision making, we're looking for ways of giving people just better comparisons and really tools to finish up that thinking process of what they can actually do about their footprint. So lots of possibilities on the kinds of outputs that are possible from this tool and its next versions. So again, following the vision statement, though, that we are working with people, and we want to continue working with people who care what they're doing and who have both profit goals and stewardship goals, and help to produce decision tools that will guide those choices. So some of the things that we are seeing as hotspots in many of these farms are the tillage. We're suggesting that people find ways of producing or using biodiesel. The use of nitrogen is, we knew it was a big factor, but it continues to be, and that is definitely an area of needed decision tools also. So optimizing the amount of N. So you're producing good yield, but still minimizing leaching and nitrous oxide production, and getting forms of nitrogen that require as little energy as possible to actually produce those and get those to the farm. Extending the lifespan of equipment, and we're also starting to introduce the idea to our farmers of sharing equipment. So I didn't really call this out, but in the small farms, one of the reasons that they have a big footprint from their infrastructure and equipment is because they're often underutilizing their equipment because they're small operations. So, for instance, our smallest farm has 3 tractors, and they need those different tractors, a few times a year, and they do different operations. But if they could share those tools with other farms, their own farm footprint would be much smaller. So again, reiterating that we are grateful to the USDA, and any opinions and recommendations expressed are mine and not those of the USDA. And that is it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for sharing. I mean, it looks like a very cool tool. So just to kind of kick off our kind of post-presentation conversation, we normally have 2 questions. The first is normally, how do you envision your tool supporting producers? But I think in your presentation you outlined that very well. So maybe we'll just go to the next one, which is more about how, what are some of the barriers in developing this tool you've come up against, and how might collaboration with others in this kind of similar field, in this group specifically, how might that help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, we've had lots of barriers. I mean, it's funny. I feel like, gosh, this actually looks like it's in a pretty good place right now. And if you had any idea of the struggle that we were in even 6 months ago, I didn't know if this would exist at all. And that was the case for at least a 2-year period, where and it's been a struggle to get the different pieces of just the tool to communicate with each other, and getting that crop and soil dynamics model to behave. And so the model that we're using in the background is well, I consider it overly complicated. It's very complicated. There are a lot of pieces to it. And so we did go, I say we, but of course I know very little about what had to be done. This was the modelers and the programmers had to pare things down a lot and just ignore large chunks of that model, so that the rest of it that we felt like we really needed could function and not spit out ridiculous numbers. So, I would like this thing going forward to continue to improve that model, but I'm a little, I just don't know to what degree that is possible without breaking the thing. So, like as part of this, the larger project, we had lab incubations and field trials to get at some of the more specific dynamics and breakdown and carbon release from organic amendments, and we've been able to work in a little bit of those findings into the model, but at this point, that's one of my concerns, I guess, is just how much we can actually tweak that model with both it not breaking, and then me, and the more agricultural people having some faith in the outputs. So, and then there are there are always humans involved with these things. So there are only a couple of people who are familiar enough with that model to know how to change anything in it and not break it. So that's definitely a concern of mine. What I'm hoping that we can do is, and we've had this conversation somewhat, and they're thinking about it, and they think that it can do something like self-learning. So, can we set this up in a way that, numbers are output, but then people can also people can do monitoring either on their own farm or more regionally to validate, and that information, maybe that would feed back centrally to the programmers here, but maybe it could be done, more site specifically, so that the model could kind of learn from, okay, this is what I thought was going to happen, this is what is actually happening, and kind of adjust in a site-specific way. Then, as I said, there are just lots of other inputs that we would like to put in, and outputs we would like to put out. So, kind of just gathering information about what is actually going to be useful for producers, and how do they need that information to be presented or feed into their operations and decision making to actually be useful. So, and then the third thing is why I'm interested in cooperating with Farm OS is it can take a long time to put in all of the information. So how do we make this? How do we make that more efficient and efficient for the producers, and how do we then use the same effort to input information for several different purposes for the grower.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. Oop, sounds like I got an echo here. So I was gonna say, sorry, Lynn, I just had to mute you there just for a second because there's a bit of an echo. But that it's kind of a bummer Mike's not on the call today because I think that you're right, that could be a very cool connection between FarmOS and this in OFoot. They were able to pull the information straight from FarmOS and begin spinning up the model that way. That could be a really cool application, I think.
And it's something that with the new FarmOS API, it should make it easier to export data directly from FarmOS into applications like OFoot. And I think that would be a really exciting thing to explore, is being able to develop the services like OFoot for farmers who are able to use FarmOS. It's I had a question, Lynn, about the other piece here that you mentioned as far as a challenge is the validation of the modeling through observations and record keeping, and that's also something that was brought up quite a bit at the State of the Soil, and was one of the driving factors in developing this working group here, the Open Ag Learning Series. Was trying to tackle that, is how do we make our models better, especially in some of these organic and regenerative agricultural systems. And I definitely saw that as a theme of some of what the Soil Renaissance conversation has been tackling as well, is trying to gather that on-farm data to start validating and having these models start to be able to learn by through that process. And I think that's where it'd be interesting to. I think that's where the conversation with some of the monitoring folks like PhotoSync and so forth gets very interesting, as far as reducing the cost and time in getting those observations, those field observations, back into the model.
Yeah. Lynn, it looks like you're on mute right now. I don't know if there's a way to...
Oh, I think you mute you.
Yeah, but now it's not letting me unmute. Okay. Great. There we go. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Let's see. So at one point, when we were really concerned about the major model working at all, we put in a really simple piece that just says, have you measured the organic matter in your soil at several years apart? What do you see as the direction and amount of change? So you can put in your percent organic matter in year X and your percent organic matter in year X or Y, and then it just converts increase or decrease in carbon to total amounts of carbon dioxide. And then we also just ask how much nitrogen fertilizer do you use, regardless of source. And it's something around 1%, but we just applied, a really simple conversion to N2O production then. So in carbon, I think that's really important, and we can run a fancy model, but um, I think it's really powerful to just get people to start doing their own monitoring wherever that's feasible. Right now, you can't monitor your own N2O, and it might be possible to get people set up to measure their own nitrogen leaching, but that's going to take some dedication. And I just I hope that when we start doing more validation, we can keep that we will keep finding patterns, and that won't just sort of blow the whole thing up and say nothing actually relates to what we thought was going on. So that's the danger of doing a lot of validation, is that it'll just show us how wrong we were.
Well, I think you make a good point, Dorn and Lynn, about, and I mean, I'm not directly a modeler myself, but in speaking to folks who do modeling, that there's sort of a move towards trying to integrate more constant monitoring and such into models, so that you can they can sort of, as you put it, Lynn, almost self-learn, so that they're constantly being validated or updated with real raw data, so that their predictions get more and more accurate. And I think as some of the sort of ways in which some of the soil and biogeochemical models get developed, hopefully in the next decade or so, that will be more of an option. In which case, that would be very cool. Being able to have an integrated framework where you're getting modeled predictions, but you can put in your own data, and it gives you a super accurate look at what you're doing. So,
yeah.
And I particularly appreciated your focus on decision support as the ultimate goal here, and that it is farmer focused to make it into a useful tool. I guess, and I think you also mentioned that a lot of the sort of the decisions, that some of the motivation we talked about was making some of the substantial libraries and tools that are already available more accessible for decision support. I think, in particular, aren't you using a lot of the Russell 2 the libraries and so forth? Isn't that,
right.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, Russell 2 is embedded in there too.
It seems to be that that's really the next stage on a lot of these, is to take it from the academic models and turn them into, again, as we were just saying, decision support tools that are documented to the point that we can customize them and open them up to more participation and validation. On the so far, for how it's, where do you see it as far as sort of the farmer-friendly interface? You mentioned that it's fairly labor-intensive getting the data in, and that's been largely a technical support or technically assisted process so far. It's not, farmers are not entering a lot of that themselves. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Most of the farmers that are in there are things that we've put in, and it's been kind of shocking to us how it can take. So let me back up for a second. The stuff that I showed you from Cornelius's analyses, that goes beyond OFoot, actually. So you wouldn't get all of that output from the current publicly available version, but you need almost as much information to just use the OFoot tool. But it really only takes maybe a couple of hours to put that information if you have it. But we've been totally shocked at, even for these really good producers, really well-managed farms, how difficult it is to get all that information together. I mean, Cornelius has spent days at each of these farms, trying to gather all the right paperwork and, trying to get the schedules down for when things happen. And literally, like last weekend, we did a presentation, and one of our farmers walked up and said, "Oh, hey, I just realized, like, you don't have this whole other folder, and I've got so and so who does this custom work. I'm like, you probably want that, huh? Yeah, we actually need that."
It's interesting. I think we've heard similar things from some folks at University of Vermont, Heather Darby, who working on a tool about, I think it's specifically mostly about nitrogen management, but the difficulty of getting good records, and that stuff is really important to accurate estimates too.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great connection to make on things like FarmOS and good information management tools. The
Right.
more, yeah, as Doran's put it a couple times, moving from the spiral notebook on the dash of your truck to something that's way more accessible and can be updated in real time. Yeah.
Yeah, it would just save a big step of converting your scribbled notes.
Yeah.
One thing that somebody mentioned at this meeting last weekend was, is there a tool, and I think that there are tools out there, but to convert a handwritten, scribbled note into a meaningful entry into a journal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that. I was just up at a Farm Hack event in Nova Scotia, and their innovation was for they were using it for inventory management in their walk-in coolers, where they could they had a dry erase board where they could take notes and take a digital image of that periodically, and it would do their inventory.
Wow.
So it's definitely and that's one of the something that I'd like to see is that so we can move towards record keeping that is digitally accessible, but doesn't require you to look at your screen all the time. I'm finding that is one of the that does affect how you interact with your farm during the day if you're constantly on your phone or tablet. So. That's an aside, but I do think that is a good I'm glad you bring that up, because I think there's a whole lot of research that could go into sort of the process of record keeping and making it not just accessible but engaging and pleasant, because if it's not, people are not going to do it on the long term. At least that's my opinion.
True.
Even with lots of great incentives to do it. And I find myself guilty of that too. So.
Yeah, I think it's this is a really interesting conversation, because there have been and one I've had before with other folks about decision support tools in general, and that there's been decision support tools in the past, and a number of them have been less successful or variable success. So some people, I think, in the ag research and extension world are skeptical of new ones, but I think a lot of what their success has to do with is user experience, and no one really wants to spend a ton of time, going through a bunch of drop-down menus, putting in every little thing. But we're more and more capable of taking inputs in a variety of different ways and making that whole experience just simple. And so it's great to hear about your experiences with getting farmers and getting their information into this tool, and how important that process is to getting good, accurate estimates, but also a good user experience and participation. Cool.
Yeah, and one person who's connected with some big organic operations said that some operations are going to using barcodes. So, for instance, every piece of equipment will have a barcode on it, and every field has a barcode associated with it. So, for those things that are coded, whenever you use this, snap a picture of that, or select that on your pad, or where and then when you go to this field, you have the barcode to just select that. To show that this is the operation you're doing, this is the field you're in with this piece of equipment. And so, boy, something like that starts to make things a lot easier.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's interesting. Yeah. Great. Well, we're at 5 o'clock now, so unless anyone has any extra questions or comments, say a big thank you to you, Lynn. It was a really interesting presentation. Great to see such a cool tool out there, and hopefully we'll be able to connect you and your team with Mike Stenta at FarmOS and some of the other folks working on similar things, and have a brainstorm about integration and stuff like that. So
great. Yes. Okay. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Thank you
Lynn.
all.
Really appreciate it.
Have a good evening.
Bye all.